Hello and welcome to London. Welcome to the Beatles London. My name is Tom Murray. I'm one of the few photographers that was allowed to photograph the Beatles on a day that is now known as Mad Day, summer of '68. And today we'd like to take you around some of the locations. We're here today at Wapping, which in those days was full of warehouses, and now it's one of the chicest areas of London to live in. So with Tower Bridge behind, I'd like to lead you through that magical day when I managed to photograph the Fab Four. So we actually stopped in a small pocket park where there was wonderful hollyhocks about 6 foot high, and the guys all steamed into the hollyhocks, and it actually became a real magical mystery tour because we decided we'd stop where we wanted and do what we wanted. And there was lots of hand signals going on and rude gestures. But the boys got out and we went into the hollyhocks, and some of the most famous photographs are taken there. But we decided to go back towards Old Street Station, and we stopped off at Swains Lane. And everyone said, why did you pick Swains Lane? I said, well, the house had yellow windows and a yellow gate. And oddly enough, 6 months ago, the man that now owns that house phoned up and has bought a print, and it's hanging in his living room. And he said the man next door remembers taking his 2 daughters out to meet the Beatles. Well, they're in their 40s now. And that was just an amazing coincidence. I mean, this shot here, we're actually almost within a few feet of where the original was taken. And John Lennon borrowed Don's jacket so he could wear it because it was a bit cold. Well, Paul went mad and took his shirt and jacket off, and he ended up going down right by the river and winding himself up with a load of chains. And then of course, the most famous picture is the one where John Lennon suddenly threw himself on the ground, closed his eyes. George picked up his glasses and put them on, and I went click. There was one more frame where John opened his eyes, and I went click again, and he jumped up. Little did I know that I would be in New York working for Time magazine the night he was shot. And I had that picture flown from England out to New York for the cover of Time, but they decided it was too spooky. And so it went back in a drawer. Now that picture became the first ever charitable donation I made, where Angelica Houston, Elizabeth Montgomery and Jack Nicholson sponsored my picture, and we raised $8,000 for charity, and that started the charity rolling. Well, here now we're back again at Wapping. 3 of the pictures are in the permanent collection of the Museum of the Docklands, which is just across the river from us. One of the great opportunities for me is that because I didn't know who I was going to photograph, I had no preconceived idea. And anyone seeing my photographs would realise there's no way they'd ever fit on a record cover. They're not square, they'd never fit on a cassette cover or on a CD cover. They're actually shot for magazines, which is they're either full page upright or double page spread. And nothing has changed, but everything has changed. The Beatles' music is still being played every second of every day, everywhere in the world. They're as famous as they were. The new show, the Cirque du Soleil, where the music's been remastered by Sir George Martin, is just spectacular. Every generation, a new bunch of kids find, wow, the Beatles, they're fabulous, their music is great. And where they were in London, London was the swinging 60s, the Beatles were the swinging 60s. And it doesn't really change or get that good. And now I'd like to introduce your host, Richard Porter, who will continue with his Beatles trip around London.
Well, thank you, Tom. Many interesting memories. And we're actually in Carnaby Street, and I'd like to introduce you to Richard.
Hello, Michael.
A guru and an expert on everything connected to the Beatles, who's going to take us through Carnaby Street as an opener. And he's also going to tell me how he became Beatles Brain of Britain.
Oh, you would have mentioned that, wouldn't you? Yeah, it sounds worse than Bird Brain, doesn't it? It's a competition they hold in Liverpool at the Beatles convention, and I won it 2 years running. Wish they thought a different title though. I mean, Beatle Brain, I mean, dear me. We're going to be going around loads of places in London. Of course, we're going to visit Abbey Road. We'll walk across the famous crossing, see the studios. We're going to see lots of film sites for A Hard Day's Night and Help. And of course, see where they did the rooftop concert for Let It Be. Lots of theatres they played in, places they lived. So lots of places we're going to see all over London on this tour today.
Amazing. I'm looking forward to it very much, Richard.
Right. And here we are in Carnaby Street, which is the swinging London street, I suppose you'd say. This is where everyone used to come and get their clothes in the 60s. It was really the mods, or the main group. They used to come and get their rather nice Italian-made suits here. But you couldn't really say the street became the victim of its own success. It's in 1966, Time magazine had a major cover story about swinging London, as they called it. It really highlighted Carnaby Street, all the pop stars you could see when coming down here. There's people like The Who and the Small Faces, I'm sure the Beatles came here as well, all came. When this article appeared, all the fans of the pop stars and lots of tourists started coming too. The pop stars went elsewhere to buy their clothes, not to be hassled by all their fans when buying them. So Carnaby Street lost its pop star clientele. For a long time it got rather tacky, lots of souvenir shops and things moved in. Even though it's kind of more fashionable now than it was for a while, it's still not the same. For a start, if we were standing right here now, we'd be run over. It was only pedestrianised in the 1970s, so it was a roadway. Of course, all the mods used to come down on their scooters down here to get all their gear. So we'd be standing right in the middle of the roadway at this point in those days.
Right, interesting.
On the corner of Carnaby Street here is this rather striking mural, just called The Spirit of Soho. Of course, Soho's the literature at the moment. The actual name Soho is an old hunting call, dates back hundreds of years. In those days, the first person, so if anyone hunting, would shout out Soho to the others, and would go after it. This was actually hunting grounds in those days. A lot changed since then, hasn't it, Mike?
Yeah, it certainly has.
Of course, another reason for stopping here is the bottom past the mural, the four people in front and others behind. There's a rather striking resemblance to a Beatles album cover I can mention. Sgt. Pepper. Where you've got the bottom part here, you've got the four people in front and others behind, very much like Sgt. Pepper. We've got the clock here, you've got the drum on Sgt. Pepper. We've got where it says Soho, it says Beatles on the album cover. It's very much based on it. Just say this mural was painted in 1991, because Sgt. Pepper came out in 1967. So Beatles affected art as well as music, of course. Okay, well, just come from Carnaby Street, so we're now in Kingly Street. And right here is a club called the Miranda Club, which in the 1960s was called the Bag o' Nails. And we're going to meet Bill Harry, who used to be with the Beatles at the club and many other places.
Hello, Richard. Hello, Mike.
Hello,
Hi.
pleased to meet you.
Of course, Bill is known for his editorship of Mersey Beats, the well-known Liverpool newspaper. But you were the Beatles in London a lot as well, weren't you?
Oh, sure. When I came down to London in 1966 and remained here, of course, the Beatles were regular club goers. Mm-hmm. And I used to be the PR for all sort of clubs like the Speakeasy, Revolution, Blazers. And of course, was always down at the Bag o' Nails, which was one of our favourite clubs. It was run by the Gunner brothers. And of course, Paul and John used to go there.
The Beatles used to come to the club because it stayed open pretty much all night, and they were recording the Sgt. Pepper album. It should be said that even though Paul met Linda, that was in May 1967, he was actually still with Jane Asher at the time. He didn't start his relationship really with Linda until about a year after that. But I believe Paul wasn't exactly very faithful to Jane Asher, and he admitted it himself in a book called Paul McCartney Many Years From Now. He actually admitted in the book he used to come to the Bag o' Nails to pick up girls, and well, he picked up Linda here, but history was made because they got married, 2 years later.
Marriages in
music
history.
They were so tight as a couple. The only time they spent any time apart, any night apart, is when Paul was in jail in Japan on drugs charges. So he arrived for a Wings tour with a case full of marijuana and right on top of his suitcase. And the police found it on top, and he's seen actually on film the customs guy opening this case. And there's a marijuana right on top.
Yes.
And he could have got, I think, 12 years in prison. But I think the Japanese authorities were a bit embarrassed and they let him go after a few nights. But he spent a few nights in jail. That's the only time Paul and Linda spent any time apart during the whole marriage.
Yes,
and
I wonder who reported him. I wonder who gave a tip off in advance.
There are some stories.
I know, yes.
Yes.
And also, I would like to read the book he wrote about being in prison, because whether you thought a lot of Linda missing her there and all the rest of it,
Yes.
but I believe he had quite a bit of a nice time there, having sharing the baths with the other inmates and things like that.
Yes.
It would have been an interesting
It
experience.
would, yes, but there you go. We're now going to head down towards Savile Row. We're going to see where the Beatles' Apple offices and recording studios were with Bill, because you went there an awful lot, didn't you?
Oh, it was great at the beginning.
Yeah. Okay, well, this is Savile Row, the heart of the tailoring industry in London. Maybe a strange place for the Beatles to have their company Apple.
Well, it was a better place than the other one they had on the other side of Oxford Street. It was so busy and soulless and everything. This has got a bit of dignity. It wasn't so full of traffic in those days and everything like that. It was a beautiful building, a beautiful place, and of course they were getting their status was rising.
But didn't the Beatles get some clothes done in Savile Row?
Oh, well, with Tommy Nutter, he's the man who made the white wedding suits for John and Yoko.
Oh, right.
And he actually went to Gibraltar for their wedding.
And I believe they were wearing Savile Row clothes when they were crossing Abbey Road for the famous album cover.
Yes, and those suits have been seen so many times by
They
people.
have,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, this is number 3 Savile Row, and this was the Beatles' Apple Company from 1968, and really till the mid-1970s they owned the place. Well, the Beatles really started Apple for tax reasons. So at the time they were paying 95% tax, hence the George Harrison song Tax Man, where they sang "There's one for you, 19 for me."
Yes.
They wanted other people to have artistic control of their own destiny, which is another reason for starting the company. And they were located here in mid-1968.
Yes.
But Bill, you came here quite a bit, didn't you, during that time?
They didn't like the men in suits.
Uh-huh.
They wanted to create something in which the men in suits did not have their control, you know. And so the Apple was a vision in some ways, which Clive Epstein originally sparked the idea when he considered, why don't you open shops which just sold things which were white?
Yeah. Well, the other end of Savile Row is the police station, and they're always a bit paranoid about the police raiding the place. And I heard one of the jobs of one of the secretaries was to flush any drugs down the toilets in case they got wind of a police raid. Well, of course, while all this was going on, the Beatles were still making music, and they started on a project initially called Get Back. There was a problem here too, because the studio was put in by a guy called John Alexis Mardas, who's the head of Apple Electronics. And he told the Beatles he was going to build them the best studio ever seen. But unfortunately, like anything is known as Magic Alex, it wasn't very magic at all. It wasn't a good studio at all. The Beatles had to hire some equipment from EMI before they could record anything down here. But they did manage to make much of what became Let It Be down in the basement here. But still, Paul McCartney was determined the Beatles would play a concert somewhere, so they decided to do it on the roof here. They did it on January the 30th, 1969. It was at lunchtime because, I think mainly because the Beatles had done their lunchtime concerts at the Cavern Club, and they wanted to maybe replicate that sort of thing. Because people were gathering around, people were having their lunch breaks from offices around here. And they were playing with their huge amplifiers and could be heard for miles around. And of course, people started gathering in the streets here, wondering what on earth was going on. This is the last straw for the local tailors. The tailors didn't want the Beatles on their doorstep in the first place, always when hippies and Hell's Angels come into the street. And at least one of the tailors called the police, try and get the concert stopped. The Savile Row police station is 150 yards away at most. It always rather surprised me the police took so long to come. It's about 5 minutes walk. Maybe there were some Beatles fans down there as well. It took them a long time to come. But eventually the police did finally arrive. But I think the Beatles were rather disappointed they weren't arrested, In fact, Ringo Starr on the Beatles anthology is hoping to be dragged off to the police station by a policeman in the film. But it didn't happen. They're allowed to finish the last song they were playing, rather ironically, Get Back. It all finished when John Lennon came to the microphone and said, "I'd like to thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves. Hope we passed the audition." That is the last ever Beatles live appearance on the roof here, so historic time on the Apple rooftop. It's ironic that Apple is still in existence to this day because it looks after the Beatles' business interests, and it's still managed by Neil Aspinall, who's actually been with the Beatles since 1961. With 3 Savile Rows now being renovated, we were hoping to film on the roof, but there's no access, unfortunately. But of course there was the famous door here at Apple, wasn't there, Bill?
Yes, and the door was bought by Mike Reed, the disc jockey, who actually gave it as a present to Julian Lennon. And he's still got it, and it's got lots and lots of signatures on the door. It's a wonderful souvenir.
Ah, that's a great story. Well, we're going to leave Apple now, and we're going down towards the former Scot St James's, where the Beatles used to go an awful lot, and you did as well, Bill.
That's right, yes.
Which is the former Scot St James's nightclub where the Beatles used to go. Around the sort of time as the Bag of Nails, really, Bill. And I think you came here a lot.
Well, it was a bit later. The whole essence of the club scene in London in relation to the Beatles, it really began in the Ad Lib Club. When the Beatles first came down, they found the Ad Lib Club was the place to go. I only went there once. And that was where all the sort of rock royalty went. The place burnt down. The next thing was the Scot St James, and that became a regular haunt. It was fantastic. We used to go every night. I remember the very first time I went down to the Scot St James. We went down, the Beatles were there, the Rolling Stones were there, Marlon Brando was there, James Baldwin, the American writer, was there. I sat down talking to James Baldwin, and it was all in a short, compact area, so we were all together, and it was a good place to chat and all the rest of it. So,
one person that Paul McCartney met for the first time at the Scot St James's was Stevie Wonder, and they became lifelong friends. In fact, of course, they recorded the song Ebony and Ivory together in the early 1980s. Another nice thing that Paul did was on the Red Rose Speedway album. Of course, Stevie Wonder is blind, and on the cover of Red Rose Speedway is written in Braille is "We Love You," which is Paul's dedication to Stevie Wonder.
With the Scot St James, the Beatles were able to associate with all their friends. And I remember Eric Burden, for instance, was going on and on about the finding of the third eye and all these mystical things, probably from the Indica bookshop, you know. And the Moody Blues were going on to me about the Bhagavad Gita book and all that. And this is where lots of talk and things went on, socialising with the Beatles, the Animals, the Moody Blues, the Rolling Stones. This is where they all gathered to talk, to relax. And it was a great place. And a time that I shall always remember.
Well, 3 members of the club were Barry Miles, Peter Asher and John Dunbar. They wanted to start their own art gallery and bookshop. They're into avant-garde and pop art. And over a drink at the Scotch, so that's just number 6 Mason's Yard, just across the road here, it was empty, so they opened it here. They call it the Indar Art Gallery. So where another very famous meeting took place. Okay, we're now heading over to the former Indar Art Gallery where John met Yoko for the first time. We're going to meet Keith Badman, well-known author and archivist. And hello, Keith. Good to see you again.
How are you doing? Good to see you. Hi, Bill. How are you doing?
Hi, Keith. How are you?
Not bad. How's yourself?
Fine.
Good.
So this was a very interesting place, and it's, as I said, it's where John met Yoko for the first time. November the 9th, 1966.
Yes.
Yoko was having an exhibition called Unfinished Paintings and Objects. And John Lennon was asked to come along and view the exhibition. But should be said, really, Paul McCartney was very much involved in it, wasn't he, Keith?
He was indeed. And the funny thing was, which I always makes me laugh, is that John came here because he thought it was going to be an orgy.
Yeah.
He did, yes, yes.
John Dunbar and the gallery co-owners apparently wrote to John saying it's going to be a happening in a bag. And he thought, aha, sex. Because it was Yoko's bagism type thing, the
That's
total
right.
communication or whatever.
Yeah, that's
But
right.
Keith, wasn't there, lots of people believe in the myth that Yoko said that was the first time she ever met John. But in fact, Yoko went to Cavendish Avenue
Yeah.
because she was getting these music signatures as a birthday present for
right.
John Cale. And she
right.
asked Paul if he would actually sign
That's right.
one of his, and he said no, get it off John Lennon.
That's
so
right.
she knew all about John,
Yeah.
and yet when she came here, lots of the press or people or the books ever since say this was the first time she ever heard of John Lennon.
It wasn't true. And in fact, there was an interview with Yoko Ono in 1968 where they said to her, were you aware of the Beatles of John Lennon? She says, no, never heard of it. Well, actually, that wasn't quite true. But
Yes.
of course, we love Yoko. We're not going to say anything wrong
Well,
about the lady.
Yoko actually said the only Beatle name she could remember was Ringo, because Ringo means apple in Japanese.
That's right.
Is that where the apple connection?
It's a very good one.
But talking about Apple, one of the first things John Lennon saw when he walked in was one of Yoko's exhibits, was literally an apple on a stand. And he went over and he looked, and he saw that Yoko was charging £200 for a refresh apple.
Yeah.
And apparently John picked up the apple, took a good look of it, and then took a great big bite out of it. Rather expensive bite out of an apple, or an art exhibit anyway.
That's right. And then Yoko turned around and said, right, I want paying. And so John said, here's an imaginary 200 quid. So it was just going round in circles all the time.
Yeah.
And John always said later on, what most impressed Yoko in this exhibition was when he went up the ladder and he looked on the ceiling painting. And there was a magnifying glass down here. And he put the magnifying glass to the ceiling. And it said yes. And if it had said no, he wouldn't have had any interest in the exhibition. But because it was positive and Yoko had put yes, it was fascinating. And of course, it was 18 months after they met here that they recorded Two Virgins and became an item.
And it was revealed by Paul when he inducted John Lennon into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that Paul had met Yoko before John. Even Paul said that when he inducted
right.
John into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
That's right, exactly, yeah.
There's a lot of different stories.
There's one other story just talk about, you were talking about what happened in the exhibition, which I thought was good, was John was fascinated, obviously, by everything in the exhibition. And he wanted a hammer and nail. And he kept to that store for years, and he said to Yoko, I want a hammer and nail. And Yoko said, no, you can't, it isn't open yet. So John said, I insist. He said, no. So John said, okay, well, I'll bang in an imaginary nail. And that's what Yoko said, that I was automatically attracted to this guy.
Imagine, we heard that before, John. Okay, we're now going to head down towards the London Palladium Theatre, where people have said Beatlemania began. Keith's coming with us, but unfortunately we're going to lose Bill at this point, so it's been great to see you, Bill.
Hi, Richard.
And see you again soon, I hope. Okay,
Bill.
see you, Bill.
Bye for now.
This is the world famous London Palladium Theatre. Of course, the Sound of Music is now the main attraction. But from the late 50s to the 1960s, a TV show was done from here called Sunday Night at the London Palladium. To give its full name, Val Parnell's Sunday Night at the London Palladium. What a mouthful that is, isn't it?
It's a very long mouthful.
Well, the Beatles first appeared on the show on October the 13th, 1963. The show got a huge audience that night. I think about 18 million people watched the show. Before that, they just appeared on kids' TV shows, really, or at least teenagers' TV shows.
People like Lenny the Lion.
Yeah,
Pop
shows like...
must have been very good for the commercial ratings that day.
He was, he was. Well, that's exactly the thing. When the Beatles appeared, they were on this show, but no one really knew how big the whole show was going to be. And of course, because of the press hype, as even then they had press hype, because of the fans outside the building and the hysteria, it was deemed Beatlemania. That was the first time the press has said Beatlemania. But of course, the funny thing was, people here that night said there might have been maybe 10.
Ah.
You know, and that's,
There's a reason for that, Keith, because the Beatles were here for most of the day.
that's right.
And most of the fans were here
That's right.
during the rehearsals.
And they'd gone home to
Well,
watch
of course,
the
they've gone
telly.
home to watch the TV.
telly, yeah.
So it has been said that the whole thing was hyped up by the press.
Yeah.
But really, it's the press were a bit late finding out about the mania.
that's
Because
right.
the fans have been around the Beatles and screaming at the Beatles for several months.
That's right.
Up and down the country.
Yeah.
But it's really the first time it happened in central London.
That's right.
And being a Sunday, it's kind of a low news day.
Had school the following day.
Exactly, and so the local Fleet Street newspapers sent their
That's right.
reporters down and camera crews
Yeah.
to film the scenes outside.
That's right.
And rather strangely, Keith, there's footage of the Beatles coming out of the Palladium, but not the actual footage of the show itself,
No.
because it wasn't kept.
And the story was, when the show ended, they were rushing out. And of course, they come rushing out to the cars. They find out the car wasn't there. They went rushing to a taxi. Then they found out the taxi was in fact a police car. And the police people inside wouldn't let the Beatles inside. And the film exists of Ringo rushing out. And he doesn't know
All of
where to
them.
go.
Yeah.
So the Beatles come out, the other three Beatles come out, and then Ringo comes out last. And you can see he's in the street.
Yeah.
Doesn't know where to go.
I think the confusion was the stage door is actually round the
That's
back,
right,
and they came
yeah.
out the front entrance.
They
I
came out
think
the wrong
that was for
entrance,
for effects, really, maybe because the press
be.
were outside here.
Exactly,
maybe,
yeah.
maybe that's why they couldn't find the car. Maybe the car was by the stage door where you,
That's
where you
right.
thought it might have been. So that
Yeah.
might be the reason.
It could have been, in fact, Tony Barrow said the day after the Palladium show, October '63, everything changed for the Beatles.
Of course, the Beatles manager, Brian Epstein, was a very theatrical guy. Just before he was a manager,
Yeah.
he wanted to become an actor.
Yeah.
He was enrolled in the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts.
Right,
Never really
that's right.
made the grade as an actor. But when his company NEMS moved to London, he wanted a very prestigious address for his company.
He did, yeah.
So he moved literally next door
He
to
did
Sutherland
indeed.
House. And that's where we're going to go
That's
now.
where we're going now.
And we're going to, it's where John Lennon gave a rather infamous interview. Let's go and see Sutherland House. This is where Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, had his London headquarters from March 1964. Before that, the company was based in Liverpool, but because things were all based in the London area, he had to move here, so he moved into this building.
Yeah.
And of course, the Beatles came here on many occasions, and this is where George Harrison and his new wife Patty gave their first press conference after their wedding.
January '66.
Absolutely. But more importantly, though, about a month after that, John Lennon gave an interview here to Maureen Cleave, running Evening Standard newspaper. In fact, Maureen spent virtually a whole day with John, both at his home in Weybridge and also here at Sutherland House. And during this interview, John was talking about his opinions on religion.
Right.
I think what he was trying to say was that church attendances were falling alarmingly in England, especially amongst young people. The young people were much more interested in going to concerts and buying records than going to church.
Right.
So John said in the interview, the Beatles are more popular than Jesus Christ. Oops.
That's right.
Maybe not the best thing to say. Well, actually, when it appeared in the Evening Standard, it's only a very small part, a very long interview,
That's right.
and it was virtually unnoticed. But a few months later, against John's knowledge or permission, the interview reappeared in an American fan magazine called Datebook. It rather changed the whole meaning of the interview, headlining the whole thing. Now John Lennon says, Beatles are bigger than Jesus Christ, with rather different meaning. Of course, when that happened, a complete rumpus took place in America, especially in the Bible Belt, the southern states. A radio station called Wacky Radio in Birmingham, Alabama, caught hold of the interview, and they organised Beatles burnings. People could come and burn the Beatles records and memorabilia. Or maybe burnt their fingers, burning their albums, and of course people went and bought them again afterwards. So anyway.
right, yeah.
But also there were demonstrations because the Beatles was just about to do a concert tour, and Brian Epstein had to fly over to America.
And he has actually left Port Merion in Wales to go fly over.
That's right.
didn't
And he had, he was badly ill at the time, didn't he?
He was rested.
He was resting after an
Wales.
He had
illness.
to do a lot of placatory interviews.
Yeah,
did he?
and he had to fly over to America
Yeah.
to say about what John actually meant. But even then, when the Beatles arrived, they had to do an interview at their hotel room in Chicago.
That's right.
And John Lennon was so nervous about
Yeah.
it, so he really had to apologise for what he said. And he threw up before the interview or
That's right.
something. He was
Yeah,
so
he was
nervous.
nervous. Yeah,
He
yeah.
was crying and throwing up before giving the interview. And actually, when you actually look at the interview, he didn't really apologise as such.
No.
He kind of just explained what he said. He's saying, I wasn't saying it as we were better than Jesus or bigger, I was just saying it as a fact.
That's right.
Were the other Beatles affected by the Lennon interview?
Well, yes, because anything one Beatle said, it affected them all. But they were fed up with touring anyway, because all the problems they had in the Philippines and Japan before the American tour.
Yeah.
But for instance, on that last American tour, in the concert in Memphis, in the Bible Belt, someone threw a firecracker on stage, and everyone looked at John thinking he'd have been
Yeah,
shot.
he'd been shot. Yeah, yeah.
So it called that. I mean, that was, they thought it's getting too much. No one could hear them live anyway.
No, that's
It's all the screams. They couldn't hear themselves play. They didn't have monitors to listen to their own music.
Yeah.
So they're getting really fed up with it, and they decided that the last concert of that tour in San Francisco would be their last ever concert.
That's right.
Apart from when they did the rooftop concert at Savile Row, of course, but the last proper concert was at the end of that American tour.
August 29th, 1966.
Yeah, and really partly brought about by the controversy over John's interview.
That's right.
Well, we're now leaving Sutherland House, which is right at Epstein's offices, so we're going to go to Marylebone Railway Station. This is where the opening scenes of the Beatles film A Hard Day's Night was filmed, and Keith's going to come with us, so let's go there. This is Marylebone Railway Station, and this is where the Beatles filmed the opening scenes of their first film, A Hard Day's Night, in 1964. Right at the start of the film, they're seen running down Boston Place, this street by the side of the station. They run down here being followed by all their fans. This is where George Harrison falls flat on his face right at the start of the film.
Accidentally.
It was actually, yeah, you're right, Keith. It was a complete accident. So it wasn't in the script. He was being chased by the fans, and he just tripped over and fell over, and brought Ringo down with him, much to the amusement of the others.
And makes John burst into a fit of laughter.
Absolutely. And most of the people running after the Beatles that day were actual Beatles fans who just somehow have found out they were going to be filming. Just came along on the off chance, catching a glimpse of their heroes. A few of the lucky ones were actually chosen to appear in the film itself.
That's right.
And I think some of them got signed photos each,
They did, yeah.
which are now worth several £1,000s if they kept them. So
That's right,
that
yeah.
was good for them. We're in the film, going back to A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles run round the corner here and enter the station over this way. So let's follow the Beatles' footsteps in A Hard Day's Night. Well, the Beatles enter the station through these doors over here. This is a great shot showing them running into the station with the fans in the background here. And John, George and Ringo are seen using 3 telephone boxes just inside here. So ironically now a branch of Marks and Spencer's. When they renovated the ticket office, they removed the telephones, unfortunately. No one knows where they are. I mean, there'd be a real collector's item now.
in your home then,
I wish I had them, but never mind. Well, anyway, the Beatles run through into the station, eventually end up on platform 1, where they get on a train. But I should say only John, George and Ringo is being followed by the fans, because Paul McCartney is sitting on a bench, wearing a disguise, a false beard and moustache. Not a very convincing one, I have to say, and I'm sure the fans were told to leave him alone, but he joined them as they get on the train and head off to do their TV show in A Hard Day's Night. Well, in the film, the Beatles used this actual station twice, both for their departure and arrival. They're seen getting into a car through the archway, driving out through the archway and down towards Baker Street, with the fans again chasing after them. Okay, well, we're going to have to say goodbye to Mike for a while. You're off somewhere else, aren't you?
Yes, I've really enjoyed the tour so far. I'm not signing off completely. I'll see you all again soon. I'm now going off to the Hammersmith Odeon, which is now called the Hammersmith Apollo, where I'm going to meet quite a famous member of a 1960s group who appeared there with the Beatles, and has lots of interesting facts and memories to tell us about.
Right.
That group also had amongst its members people like Eric Clapton, Beck and Jimmy Page. So, amongst the people who are going to be watching this, many probably will have worked out already who I'm going to see, but for those who have not, I tell you, it's worth the wait.
Okay, we're heading off now to Marylebone Registry Office, where two of the Beatles got married. So let's go, shall we?
Okay, bye.
See you, bye. This is the Westminster Council House, also holds the Westminster Registry Office. This is where two of the Beatles got married. The first Beatle to be married here was Paul McCartney. He married Linda here on March the 12th, 1969. Paul was actually the last Beatle to be married, and outside the office that day were loads of Beatles fans crying their eyes out. Their favourite Beatle had got married. There's great film footage of that, isn't there, Keith?
There is, yeah. There's a great clip where you see Paul and Linda coming down these stairs, and out the front are all these, it seems hundreds, literally, maybe even more, of all these girls. They're bawling their eyes out, saying, "You should have married me." Not me myself. "You should have married me instead of Linda." And it's great film footage. Just, you know, it was the last of the Beatles, as we should say, to get married, and Paul was the eternal bachelor Beatle, but suddenly he was snared by the lovely Linda Eastman.
Well, the second Beatle to get married here was Ringo Starr, who married actress Barbara Bach in April 1981. And it was not long after the death of John Lennon.
That's right.
And it was great because George and Paul also turned up to the wedding, didn't they,
did,
Keith?
and that was amazing because, again, there's this fabulous news film. And I remember taping it that night on the BBC One News, and you've got, you know, you had three of the Beatles back together again, which I thought was absolutely staggering. And then interestingly, after they'd done obviously they got married, they went off and they held a reception for the wedding. And Paul, George and Ringo actually played together, well, spoons and...
Yeah, they had a jam together,
They had a little
didn't they?
jam, and there's pictures, which is in my book, of the three of them performing together. Obviously it wasn't the same, but it was great how the three Beatles were together in this building in 1981.
There's a great picture of Ringo and Barbara coming out afterwards with their bridesmaids.
Yeah.
Incidentally, for trivia buffs, Barbara's dress was designed by the Emanuels. Was designed Princess Diana's dress,
Indeed.
her wedding to Charles some months later. So there you go.
There we go.
And this is where I got married as well.
Oh.
No coincidence. My wife Irina
Not
and
to
I,
me.
both of course huge Beatles fans. We
That's
wanted
right.
somewhere Beatley to get married, as it brought us together in the first place. So we decided to get married here. So there you go.
And also a bit cheaper than Gibraltar.
A little bit, yeah. Okay, well next we're going to go to see Montacute Square, where both Ringo Starr and John Lennon lived for a while, and also Jimi Hendrix as well. So a lot of stories to tell there.
Loads to
And
look
an infamous,
Loads.
infamous photograph taken there as well too, wasn't
There
there? So
certainly is.
let's go there, shall we? Okay, well this is number 34 Montague Square, and this place was originally rented by Ringo in 1965. He lived here with his then wife Maureen.
Yeah.
In fact, soon after moving in, Maureen gave birth to their first son, Zach,
Indeed.
Now, of course, he's a drummer himself,
Yeah.
and recently been on tour with The Who.
With The Who, no less.
And played with Oasis as well, ironically,
That's right.
being known as a Beatle copy band. They've got now Ringo Starr's son on their last album.
Touch of endorsement, I think you might
Yeah.
say. Yeah.
Well, anyway, also while living here, Ringo and the other Beatles were given the MBE medals by the Queen at Buckingham Palace. And Paula lived nearby. Both he and Ringo left from the apartment here to go to the palace. They're picked up by the Beatles chauffeur Alf Bicknell and drove to the palace with the others. But Ringo and his family only lived here a short time. They bought a house out in Weybridge, close to where John Lennon was living.
The Beatle Belt.
Yeah. But Ringo kept hold of the apartment because he wanted to use it when the Beatles were doing late night recording sessions at Abbey Road, and also when he was going to the clubs in London.
Yeah.
But then he let Paul McCartney use the basement for a while as a demo recording studio. And Paul McCartney did work on songs like Eleanor Rigby down in the basement here. He also had lots of his avant-garde friends like William Burroughs did some experimental tapes here, for instance. Well, anyway, in about mid-66, Paul had moved the studio out, and Chaz Chandler, the former bass player of the Animals, had just discovered Jimi Hendrix playing in New York.
Yeah.
And they wanted somewhere to live in London, so Ringo let them use the apartments, and Jimmy and his girlfriend Cathy Etchingham lived in the basement here, and had a lot of parties where they invited lots of their rock and roll friends,
That's right.
including all the Beatles must have come here, and I think Keith Moon, certainly of The Who, and loads of other people as well. So they lived here for a few months. And then the apartment was empty again. In fact, I think Jimmy got evicted from the apartment due to all the noise they were making with the parties. And also, he had a bit of a stormy relationship with Cathy Etchingham, his girlfriend. There's a load of rows as well, so that didn't help either. Anyway, for about a year, the apartment was empty. But then John and Yoko moved in. They were just looking for somewhere to live, and Ringo let them use the apartment. Well, it's while John and Yoko lived here, they had this rather controversial picture taken down in the basement, the infamous Two Virgins album cover. To give her its full name, Unfinished Music Volume 1, The Two Virgins.
May 1968.
And this is a spoof done by Private Eye, and a little sticker covering John's private parts that reads, Member of the British Empire. Which is, of course, the name in the medal the Beatles was given a few years earlier, but a rather strange place for a medal, don't you think? Well, the chairman of EMI Records, Sir Joseph Lockwood, was shown the album cover, and he virtually had a heart attack, realising the problems it would cause, and the album came out.
That's it. They refused to handle it, as
Yes,
they say.
and Paul McCartney, forever the PR man of the Beatles, had the same reaction when he saw it. And a bigger meeting was planned with Joseph Lockwood and John and Yoko and Paul McCartney.
That's right.
And apparently Joseph Lockwood said to John and Yoko, why on earth are you doing this?
That's right.
To which John said, it's artistic. Shocking people is an art form. Well, Joseph Lockwood got really angry at this and said, if you wanted something artistic, you at least get two better looking people to appear on your album cover.
That's right.
Then turning towards Paul, he said, why don't you get Paul to do it? He's far prettier than you are. We'll get a statue from the park, anything but that.
Yes, that was, I think that's just, that in itself, I think was so disrespectful for John for everything that he had done for EMI over the years, which I thought was absolutely shocking. And so the album had actually come out, and then of course, it had to be the album was censored, you had the brown bags, and it was Tetragrammaphone.
Yes, it was distributed by another company because EMI wouldn't touch it.
EMI wouldn't touch it.
Wouldn't touch the cover.
It wouldn't touch the cover.
Oh dear. Okay, we're now heading down to famous Baker Street, of course famous for Sherlock Holmes, but also famous for the Beatles' Apple shop in the 1960s. Well, across the road is now the Reed Employment Office. Doesn't really look much in now, does it? But it looked rather different in the 1960s when the Beatles owned it. It looked rather more like this. A bit more colourful, don't you think?
Indeed.
This is the site of the Beatles' first Apple project. Their shop here on Baker Street just called Apple. Of course, they started Apple for tax reasons. So they were paying 95% tax.
Yeah.
They had to have some sort of idea on how to spend some money or the tax man would get it. The original idea was, wasn't it greetings card shops or something,
It was
Keith?
going to be just like like greeting cards, and then of course it developed into what they anticipated would be Apple Films, Apple Electronics, and of course Apple Records, of course. Yeah. And when this building was open, you had the top to toe with this amazing design. Yeah. Designed by the Fool.
Well, the original idea of the greetings cards was dropped as being too boring. Yeah. So they got this group of Dutch clothes designers called the Fool, who actually designed the clothes the Beatles wore on the All You Need Is Love, or the Our World TV show. They were given, was it a hell of a lot of money to go away and design the clothes.
That's right, yeah.
And the manager of the shop was Pete Shotton, who was John's great friend from school. And also, of course, I found a member of the Quarrymen, John's first band.
That's right.
And Pete wanted to run the shop in a normal commercial way, but the Beatles didn't. No. So apparently the Fool...
They were never shopkeepers, as the Beatles always said.
The Fool wanted hand-woven silk labels on each garment. Yeah. And they cost more to produce than the clothes themselves. And Pete was horrified by this and went to John Lennon to complain. But John just said to Pete, remember Pete, we're not business freaks, we're doing this as artists. The Fool can do what they like. Yeah. And of course the clothes couldn't be sold at a profit, so that was a disaster. Yeah. Also, the place had no security. It was supposed to be a place where beautiful people could buy beautiful things. Yes. That was the sort of advertising blurb. But unfortunately, when people that came here took the clothes, but didn't really like to pay for them very much.
They didn't think you had to pay for them.
There was no security, and because being the Beatles store, people wanted souvenirs and didn't mind if they just took them. With the end, the Beatles got really fed up with the place and closed it down in July 1968.
And of course, all the stuff was technically given away. Yeah. But only once the Beatles and their wives and friends and hangers.
Yeah. On the last day, the doors of the shop were left open. Anyone could come in off the street and take what they like without paying for it. As you were saying, I think Yoko had come along and took loads of stuff the night before. They all did. They all took the best stuff.
That's right. And what they didn't realise is when they took the clothes, they didn't realise it was still liability for tax. Yeah. So of course they were still liable for the clothes they'd given away. They were still liable for tax. Yes.
Well, I should say the mural went long before the shop closed because it didn't have planning permission from the local council. That's right, so they insisted it be whitewashed over. But just a few years ago, a blue plaque was put on the building here to John Lennon. That reads John Lennon, musician and songwriter, 1940 to 1980. We're a strange place to put it. These are normally put up where people lived. I think Montacute Square, where we were earlier, had been a lot better, don't you think? Yeah. Very strange, but there you go.
Very strange, yeah.
Anyway, just up the road here in Baker Street is the London Beatles store, so let's go there. Come Ed. Again, getting run over in the process. So here we are, Keith. Famous. Okay, I'm here with Howard Cohen, the owner of the London Beatles store.
Hi.
How long have you had the shop, Howard?
Oh, what's it now? We're in our seventh year. Actually, it's 7 years next month, which is quite amazing. Doesn't seem that.
Yeah. And you're a lifelong Beatles fan, yes?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. Well, I think probably my first memories was my cousin, who's quite a famous Beatles fan, and when I was about 3 years old, I do remember going to her house and hearing and seeing nothing but Beatles.
So Howard, just show us around the shop a bit what you have in here.
Yeah, I mean it's quite amazing the last few years what Beatles stuff's come out. You've got to the stage where there's nothing you can't wear or can't have in your house without the Beatles on. Everything, you've got ties, t-shirts, for the home you've got cup sets, cookie jars, makeup bags, wallets, and even some socks to keep your feet warm. So there's nothing you can't get about the Beatles, and if you don't know the time, you even got a clock.
And downstairs, of course, you have the memorabilia gallery.
That's new, yes. That's like photography, autographs, obviously, original 60s memorabilia. And we're doing it like a place where your general person who wants a T-shirt, make it interesting enough and put exhibitions on there that people don't have to buy anything. They can actually spend quite a bit of time looking at the stuff, you know. And obviously, if people want to buy it, it's for sale too. But it's just, the main thing with the gallery is somewhere extra for people to look, because they do always think there's a museum in London. Obviously, we haven't got the space to do that.
No.
But if we can make a little space interesting enough to see some Beatles history, yeah. My favourite thing in the gallery has to be John Lennon's personal butcher cover. Even though everything in there is obviously interesting, I don't have hardly any of it because some of it's so rare and unique. But being something of John that was obviously personal to him for a lot of time, and sending it to somebody with a note, that has got to be my favourite piece.
Well, thanks, Howard. It's been great. Yeah. We're now going to head off to see where Paul McCartney lived with his then girlfriend Jane Asher and wrote many songs. So let's head down there. Okay, this is number 57 Wimpole Street. During the 1960s, it was the family home of the Asher family.
It famously was.
Of course, Dr. Asher was a well-known psychiatrist, and wife Margaret was professor of music at the Guildhall School of Music. Used to teach her students down in the basement here. Of course, they had some famous children, including Peter Asher, part of Peter and Gordon, the famous duo of the 60s.
Indeed, who sang Paul McCartney.
And of course they had many Lennon and McCartney songs to sing, because just so happens his sister Jane was dating Paul McCartney.
Indeed.
Of course, Jane Asher is a famous actress, and they met at, when the Beatles were doing a concert at the Royal Albert Hall
in
1963. And Jane was asked to do a photographic session for the Radio Times listings magazine, reacting to the people on stage. And she was seen screaming at the Beatles. Which you met them all backstage, and I believe both George and Paul liked her.
That's right, yeah.
But apparently Paul liked her better.
Everyone had the impression that Jane was going to be most close with George, but of course it went the other way, and of course she became Paul's regular girlfriend for the next 5 years.
Yes, and rather strangely, I suppose, for the 60s, the Asher family let Paul stay here. He basically lived here for quite a few years, until 1966. He had his bedroom right at the top of the house at the back. He called it like an artist's garret. It's a very small room. I remember reading somewhere he had his MBE stored under the bed with his often the violin bass guitar. So it's a very small room.
Wow.
Of course, John Lennon came here a lot here as well. And John and Paul wrote songs here, including I Want to Hold Your Hand, which they wrote, they said, nose to nose, in Mrs. Asher's basement here.
Wow.
Of course, it's their first #1 record in America, and really started their career over here. Well, another song started out when Paul McCartney woke up in his bedroom at the top of the house at the back early one morning with a tune in his head. He went to the piano he had by the bed to play the tune. But he had a rather strange title to start with, didn't it, Keith?
He did. When it was originally started, it was actually called Scrambled Eggs, because he couldn't think of another line.
And the first line went, scrambled eggs, baby, how I love your legs, I think. Yeah.
And Paul just couldn't believe that he thought the song had been written by someone else. So he was going around to people saying, have you heard this song? Have you heard this song? And there's always been a bit of a discrepancy about what the date of the song was. But it definitely was towards the end of 63, because January 64, when the Beatles were in Paris, George Martin recalls Paul playing the song to him on the piano in their bedroom. And that was January 64. Yes. And he wasn't recorded, of course, until 65, appeared on the Help album.
And Richard Lester remembered it from the set of Hard Day's Night as well.
Which again is 64 as well. So the song was already, like a year and a half out of date by the time they'd actually come to record it. Easy.
Well, Paul only wrote the lyrics when he was on holiday in Portugal, and of course he called it Yesterday. It's been recorded by about 3,000 people since 1965 and played on American radio some 8 million times.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, anyway, Paul and Jane were together for about 5 years. But really, strangely, their relationship kind of started breaking up when they moved out of here, because Paul loved the Asher family. It's a very forward-thinking family for the 60s. He loved Jane's mother, Margaret, so not literally, but he got on really well with her. And he loved the whole family atmosphere. When it was just Paul and Jane together at Paul's home in Cavendish Avenue, they started growing apart. Paul's getting into the drug scene and stuff, and Jane wasn't at all. And Paul was seeing other women, it has to be said.
Oh dear. Oh,
and
dear.
well, he actually admitted it himself in that book, Paul
Fair
McCartney,
enough.
many years from now. He wasn't very faithful to Jane.
Not Paul,
And
not Paulie.
that's of course, Jane announced the engagement was off on national TV, didn't
That's
she,
right.
Keith?
It was back in the 60s, between 67 and 69, the most talked about, most celebrated chat show was D Time, hosted by Simon D. And it was a massive ratings winner. And Jane Asher was a guest one night in May 1968. And of course, lo and behold, she announced live on national TV that she was no longer engaged to Paul. And of course, lo and behold, Paul was watching the show back home at St John's Wood. So he was dumped live on air.
And that ironic.
Not a memorable broadcast, as they say.
No. Okay, well, we're going to head off from here, and we're going to bit of a journey up to a certain street called Abbey Road. You might have heard of before.
No.
A certain
never heard of
recording
it.
studio and a zebra crossing.
Decca?
So I think that's a
There's a
good place.
Decca.
Oh no, they've only turned down the Beatles. We're not going
yeah.
there.
No, we won't
We're
go
not
there.
worried with them. No, no. Let's go to Abbey Road. Okay, we're right here attached to St John's Wood Underground Station. Is my new place, the Beatles Coffee Shop. So I bought just a few months ago. Used to be known as the Abbey Road Cafe, and I've been coming here virtually every day since it opened. Today I published my book, Guide to the Beatles London. It's a great way of ending the tour, coming to the coffee shop. Just a few months ago, the previous owner just called me up. I was on holiday. Said, "Do you want to buy it?" I said, "Yes, please." So me and my wife, Irina, now we own the coffee shop. We've got lots of nice souvenirs, including the mugs, postcards, and we have T-shirts. We also sell official Abbey Road Studios merchandise.
Matches?
So don't have any, no, I don't have any shop at Abbey Road itself, so we sell their stuff here. So very nice place to have.
nice.
Of course, just yards from here, Keith's Abbey Road, so let's go, shall we?
I've heard of that place.
Yeah, I think I've heard it somewhere before, yeah. This is Abbey Road, and this is the famous crossing, as of course seen on the Beatles album cover, called Abbey Road. The Beatles shot the picture on August the 8th, 1969, 11:35 in the morning. Yes, I know it's the exact minute. How anal is
amazing.
that?
That's
oh
pretty
well.
impressive, Richard.
Yeah, and since then, God knows how many millions of people have crossed Abbey Road since. It must be. At Abbey Road Studios, I reckon 150,000 people go across here every year.
Yeah.
So since it's 1969, well, you do the maths, it's an awful lot
That's
of
a
people.
hell of a lot of people.
And of course, it was that famous album cover that's one of the things that sparked off the rumour about Paul McCartney being dead. It was already started by a couple of students writing a student newspaper in America. And people have been reading things into Beatles song lyrics and Beatles album covers for God knows how long. And they thought it would be a good idea to make up their own story. That Paul had actually died in a car accident in 1966. The Beatles got an imposter to take Paul's place in the band, so their fame wouldn't be affected. But also, according to them, the Beatles felt rather guilty about doing this, to put various clues on album covers and on songs, the fact that Paul was really dead. Lots of these so-called clues can be found on the Abbey Road album cover. It's supposed to be Paul McCartney's funeral procession, with George Harrison dressed as the gravedigger, Ringo Starr, the undertaker, and John Lennon, the preacher. And Paul is wearing an old suit and is barefoot, supposedly how bodies are buried. So we have a body. Apparently Paulie's walking to his own funeral. Don't really get that. Also, Paul's holding his cigarette in his right hand. And people said, aha, the real Paul McCartney is left-handed. That can't be Paul, it must be the imposter. who they said was actually an actor called William Campbell, who won a Beatle lookalike contest to take Paul McCartney's place. He went under the alias Billy Shears, hence Sgt. Pepper, introducing a new singer to the band. All very silly, of course.
Of course.
Also parked by the crossing in the picture is a Volkswagen Beetle car. The licence plate, the second part, reads 281F. If you believe the rumour, 28IF. This is supposed to signify that Paul McCartney would have been 28 years old if he was still alive. I give up.
I know,
This is
staggering.
ridiculous, isn't it? I mean,
pretty staggering.
and we already told a few of the clues. There's so many more. We could do a whole DVD on
And the
Paul is
barefoot
dead.
is mourning in the Scilly Isles.
Yeah, and it's. I thought it was India. Oh well, whatever
Yeah,
whichever story you believe,
And
it's.
possibly India.
Of course, Paul's out of step with the others, kind of drawing attention to himself was another story. And Paul actually kind of got his own back on the thing many years later in the 90s. He called an album Paul is Live.
That's right.
And he came back to the crossing with the same photographer, Ian McMillan, and to reshoot the picture with just Paul, with his dog, a dog called Arrow. And for the album Paul is Live, they superimposed Paul with the original Abbey Road pictures and took the other Beatles out.
Yeah.
They kept on the Volkswagen car, but changed the licence plate. This time it's not read 28 if. This time it reads 51 is. Paul's age when that picture was taken. Just Paul's way of saying he's very much still alive and still making records.
Yeah, that's right.
And of course, since then, said God knows how many people have crossed. Lots of famous people too. Even Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, when she visited Abbey Road, that she got out of the car this side and walked across the crossing, and so she did it. I'll tell you another story. One day, I was giving my tour, and I was talking about the Paul is dead rumour.
Yeah.
Standing by the crossing, saw this blue Mercedes car come down the Abbey Road.
Yeah.
Licence plate 900 MPL.
No!
Paul McCartney's car. Right at the moment, I was going through all the clues about Paul being dead.
You couldn't make it up.
So I stopped in mid-sentence and said to my group, that's Paul McCartney's car, run to the studios now. So I reckon he was going to Abbey Road Studios, and we just about got there to see him go in. So we saw Paul McCartney at a Beatles tour outside Abbey
amazing.
Road, so that was pretty good.
How amazing is that?
So on that note, we should go over to Abbey Road Studios itself, shouldn't we? Abbey Road Studios, because the Beatles recorded virtually every song. They recorded some 191 songs here.
Yeah.
About that 210 they did. Only in about 7.5 years.
Yeah.
So amazing. They've recorded so many songs in such short time.
Some of the finest songs the world's ever heard.
Well, they came here for the first time on June the 6th, 1962. Their recording test with George Martin. They sang many songs for George that day. And later on, listening to all the songs in the control room, George gave them a long lecture on how to make records. Then he said to the Beatles, OK, I've had my say, now you tell me, is there anything you don't like? To which George looked George Martin up and down and said, well, for a start, I don't like your tie. I love it, don't you? Great humour. And George Martin said after that, that's really got them the recording contract,
That's right,
and
exactly,
the rest, as they say, is history.
They fell in love with each other straight away.
They did.
As they say.
And I said virtually everything was done here in the studio, but anything that wasn't done here was the Let It Be album. There's two main studios in those days, Studios 1 and 2, not surprisingly.
Right.
Studio 1 is the main orchestral studio. That's where the Beatles recorded All You Need Is Love on June the 25th, 1967, in front of a worldwide TV audience, some 400 million people. It's one of the world's first TV satellite link-ups.
Our World.
Certainly very much an historic occasion. It's like the Our World show. The studio they used mostly was Studio 2, wasn't it,
Studio
Keith?
2, that was where the Beatles effectively created most memorable work. And they did use other studios in London, like Trident and, Olympic. But this was where the main bulk of their music was made and created, with George Martin at the helm.
Yeah.
And 40 years on, some of the early stuff, 30 years the later stuff, still some of the finest music the world will ever hear, without any doubt.
And they're great recordings as well, because The equipment at Abbey Road wasn't the best.
No.
American studios actually had better actual recording equipment.
It was.
But the producer, of course, George Martin, and the engineers were the best in the world.
They were. Well, that was interesting because when Paul had even said many times he wanted to record in America because he was a great lover, like we all are, of Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys. And of course, by 65, the Beach Boys, Brian Wilson, were using 8 tracks. And of course, Abbey Road was still on 4. Because you're thinking of Sgt. Pepper, White Album was 4 tracks. And the Beatles didn't start to use 8 track until Abbey Road, and that wasn't until 69. So it's incredible to think that EMI was very much behind Capitol in America, obviously.
Of course, the Beatles really changed the way things were done here at Abbey Road. Their first album, Please Please Me, was recorded in one day, February 11th, 1963.
The second album, even longer.
Even longer. Getting the Rattles here, folks. You know the Rattles.
Yeah, we love the Rattles.
And they're, of course, by the time of Sgt. Pepper, that took 4 months.
Yeah.
Because by then, they'd given up touring.
That's right.
They can now spend as long as they liked in the studio without going out on the road. Of course, EMI weren't right how much money they were spending.
Yeah.
No, they're going to get it back in droves.
That's
So
right, yeah.
that took 4 months. And it was by then also they're recording through the night.
They were.
And often the fans would be a bit of a pest. Some of the fans actually break into the studio and found in false ceilings and in cupboards and interrupt recording sessions.
Yeah.
On one occasion, though, the fans became very useful. It's in February 1968 when the Beatles were recording the song Across the Universe. And John Lennon decided he'd like to use some female singers on backing vocals. Where you get singers from? It was late at night, there was no one around. Then he thought, aha, the fans. And John asked Paul to come out, seeing any fans left. Luckily there was still some here. So Paul went up to them and asked them very mysteriously, can any of you sing? And these 2 girls said yes. Their names were Gayleen Peace and Lizzie Bravo.
Right.
They were just outside the studio, they were quite regular fans. So Paul said, when they said yes, then Paul said, well, come inside the studio, please. We need someone to sing with us.
Yeah.
So the fans went inside, met their heroes, and sang backing vocals on a Beatles song. And can you imagine that? I think I'd be too nervous, though. You can imagine trying to sing with the Beatles watching you. I don't think I'd get anything out from my voice.
You couldn't make it up.
Couldn't make it up, could you?
Make it up.
Well, the Beatles made their last ever appearance here at Abbey Road as a group, recording the song I Me Mine in January 1970. Actually, John had already left the group by then. He was getting fed up with it all, and so it's only Paul, George and Ringo here that day. And that was the end of the Beatles here at Abbey Road.
That was it.
Okay, Keith, we're now going to leave this very famous landmark of Abbey Road. We're going to go to another famous landmark, the Royal Albert Hall, where the Beatles played on many occasions. So let's go. Okay, this is the Royal Albert Hall, very famous theatre. And of course named after Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria. We have his statue right here. On the other side of the theatre is the Albert Memorial, the amazing memorial in gold, isn't it, Keith?
Indeed it is.
Very important Beatle place as well. The Beatles first played here, I believe, the first time in April '63. It was a concert, was it BBC Radio, I believe?
And there was a famous...
there were many people on the show, weren't there? And the Beatles were just one of them.
Yeah.
But they were, I think, at the top of the bill, weren't they?
They were, and you had a famous member of the audience, of course.
Yes, because Jane Asher, she was already a well-known actress, and she was asked to do a photo shoot for the Radio Times magazine. She was in the audience, was asked to react to the people on stage by clapping or not looking bored or whatever. And for the Beatles, she was seen screaming.
Yeah.
Well, apparently she met them all backstage, and I hear both George and Paul liked her, but she got on better with Paul, and that's when their relationship started.
And
so
it
that
went on for 5 years, amazing enough.
Yeah, and also in the audience that night were the Rolling Stones, because the Beatles had met them just a few days earlier at the Crawdaddy Club in Richmond, and went back to a party at their apartment in Chelsea.
That's right.
And the Beatles invited the Stones to the Albert Hall to be in the audience.
To watch the gig,
And after the show, George Jamelski, the manager of the Stones, and Brian Jones was helping the Beatles roadies load their van after the gig. And Brian Jones was mistaken for a Beatle. He had a sort of Beatle haircut.
It was his first
and he was mobbed by all the fans. He had to be dragged away by the security.
And he liked the idea of getting worse.
He loved it. He was muttering as he was going away, I want more of this, I want more of this. Of course he did later on. And just after that, the Beatles and the Stones actually played at the same gig at the Albert Hall, didn't they?
They did, yeah. Fabulous.
Yeah. Well, anyway, another very famous concert here was the Concert for George, which was the memorial concert for George.
2002.
Exactly a year to the day after George died.
Yeah.
And of course, it was a very moving occasion because all George's friends came along, including Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, both played.
Surprisingly not Bob Dylan.
Perhaps it's the only time Paul and Ringo had played on the same bill since the Beatles.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, I guess so. And it was very moving.
Yeah.
There's a lot of the great songs, George songs, but also a very humorous moment with Monty Python, because George is a huge fan of Monty Python, and they did their song "Sit on My Face and Tell Me That You Love Me." And then at the end of the show, they mooned the audience, they turned their back to the audience, and showed their bare bottoms, which is, probably the only time the Royal Albert Hall's been mooned, I think. So absolute classic.
Yeah,
but it was very moving at the end when Joe Brown did "See You in My Dreams."
And all the petals.
I mean, how you can listen to that and not be moved to tears? You have to be not human,
and all
basically.
the petals falling from the ceiling.
Yeah.
Very
so,
sad.
lots of lovely memories.
Paul and Ringo performed at that Hollywood Bowl.
They did. That's right.
Of
course they did.
Yes.
Yeah.
Our little draw.
Okay. Yeah. But the only time in England.
Only time in England.
Yeah. There you
go. Prove us wrong. That's what we say.
That's it. And just down the road from here is rather strangely named BBC Paris Studios in London. Now, where the Beatles recorded many shows for the BBC. Let's go down there, shall we?
Come on, let's go.
Okay, well this building is now LA Fitness, a gym, but during the 60s, in fact until the 90s, it was the BBC Paris Studios. And I still can't find out why they call it the Paris Studios, but it's in the middle of London, but there you go. Well, very important for the Beatles because they did loads of radio shows for the BBC, mainly in 1963. Reason being, in those days, the BBC could only play a certain number of records per hour. Everything else had to be recorded in BBC studios.
As they called it, needle time.
Needle time, yeah. And the Beatles actually had their own radio show called Pop Go the Beatles. I think it was about 13 of them, wasn't there, Keith? Something like that. And so the Beatles in 1963 spent more times in BBC studios than they did at Abbey Road, for instance. And they did, 37 songs for the BBC. They never did for EMI.
That's right.
Mainly cover versions, apart from that Lennon McCartney song I'll Be On My Way, which they gave to Billy J. Kramer to record. All the rest are cover versions by their heroes like Chuck Berry, Little Richard and all that lot.
Like, Ooh My Soul and things like that. Yeah.
It wasn't until 1994 these songs were released commercially on the album called Live at the BBC. And the album cover was shot right outside these doors, actually looking in that direction just down the road, with the Beatles seemingly walking into the studio. Or actually, they were coming out, they'd just done a session, they were coming out and were photographed by Diesel Hoffman, I think it was. Yeah.
Where to now then, Richard?
Oh, we're going to Green Street, where the Beatles lived all together for a while.
Wow.
Yeah, so let's go there. Well, this building, now covered in scaffolding behind us, is number 57 Green Street. It's where the Beatles all lived together in 1963. It's the only place that actually lived all together, wasn't it, Keith?
Amazing. Yeah, amazing.
They moved in, and it's supposed to be quite a secret, but the fans, of course, found out about it. It's a really funny story. The Beatles had a friend living the other side of the road. They couldn't just walk across to see him. I think it was George had to get into a taxi outside number 57. The taxi would drive around the block and come up the other end of the street. He would stop outside his friend's house and go in before the fans ran across the road, realising what was going on. So talk about Beatlemania.
Beatlemania, 63.
And they did a photo session here. I think it was Leslie Bryce of Beatles Monthly.
Monthly,
sort of a day in the life of the Beatles. He took a picture of them leaning over a balcony, and that picture was used as a gift to fan club members when they joined. But great to have you with us. And it was machine signed by the Beatles. There's so many people think now that those real autographs.
No.
I get so many people emailing me saying, oh, I got this amazing picture of the Beatles signed by them. It must be worth thousands. And of course, it's worth a few quid basically.
Yes.
Because
Nice
it's
to
machine
have.
printed, but it's nice to have.
It certainly is, yeah.
Well, anyway, just down the road from here is Chapel Street, where Brian Epstein lived and of course tragically died. Let's go and see Chapel Street. Okay, this is number 24 Chapel Street. This is the London home of Brian Epstein, of course the Beatles manager. And the Beatles came here, of course, on many occasions for various parties, including the very famous party held here for the launch of the Sgt. Pepper album in May 1967. All the Beatles were here, lots of press, and a certain female photographer from New York called Linda Easterman, who had met Paul a few days earlier at the Bag of Nails Club in Soho, and had met also Brian Epstein, who managed to get her into the party as a photographer. And Paul and Linda were actually photographed together for the first time at that party.
Engaged in deep conversation.
Absolutely. And of course, about 2 years after that, they became husband and wife.
That's right.
That was, of course, Linda
and in
McCartney.
there's numerous shots of the Beatles posing outside on these steps.
Here is one of them.
Here is one of them.
And you see how little it's changed. Even the door knocker is
Amazing.
exactly the
Railings,
same.
possibly.
The door, the railings, everything is unchanged. And on a sadder note, this is where Brian Epstein died on August the 27th, 1967. The Beatles themselves are in Bangor in Wales with the Maharishi, and Brian was going to join them, I think about the day afterwards. It was a holiday weekend, and Brian wanted to have a party at his home in the country in Sussex, and he invited some people along. The people he invited couldn't turn up. So he came into London and came back to Chapel Street, locked himself in his room here. The next day, the living housekeepers couldn't wake him up. They called for a doctor, I think the police, and also called Alistair Taylor, who was Brian's personal assistant from the very early days,
And he was doing some business
general
with Cream at
manager
the
at
moment, wasn't
NEMS. And he came along too. And Alistair looked around and he saw that a lot of Brian did have pills in the place, but most of the boxes were at least half full, if not completely full. So there was no sign of suicide. A lot of people said that Brian committed suicide, but it was certainly accidental because his father had died not long before and has a very, very close family. And Brian was looking after his mother, of course, grieving over the death of her husband. And there's no way that Brian would put Queenie Epstein through another death in the family. So they were very, very close as a family, weren't they, Keith?
Yeah, they were, very much so.
And also Brian was due to fly out to Canada, I think, a few days afterwards to do a TV show or something with his friend Nat Weiss.
That's right, Nat Weiss,
And so there was no way it was suicide. And although one Beatles book said that Brian was murdered. What a load of baloney.
That's right.
That's not true either. But it's very sad, Brian's death.
Artistic licence, as they say.
And as John Lennon said after that, the Beatles are like a headless chicken without Brian Epstein, because it's him that managed all their affairs, organised their tours. Although some people say because the Beatles weren't touring anymore, Brian's influence had waned. He's spending lots of time going around clubs and casinos and stuff, and kind of losing it a bit as a person, people were saying. But again, there was no sign of suicide, really.
And as you say, when Epstein died, John Lennon remarked the Beatles were like finished. And in business terms, they did start to struggle.
Yeah, of course, after that, Apple was a complete nightmare for them,
That's right.
business-wise. So,
And
yeah, John was correct, really.
And of course, as soon as Epstein sadly had died, the Beatles moved into the next project, which was National Mystery Tour.
Yeah, which was a complete disaster as well,
Another
in terms of
disaster.
organisation, at least.
That's
I mean,
right.
it was good as a film, but organisation-wise, it was a total mess. And it wouldn't have been with Brian had been there, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's right.
Because if it wasn't for Brian Epstein, we wouldn't be here now.
No.
They wouldn't have got out of Liverpool.
No, very much so.
And he had so much faith in them.
He did.
And really put them in suits, cleaned out their rats, and really got them where they were.
Without any doubt.
So we
somebody
have to
thought
give Brian a lot of
that.
credit
Totally.
for all that.
Dear
yeah.
old Brian.
Yeah.
Totally agree. Dear old Brian.
Well, anyway, we're going to Buckingham Palace
Wow.
now. We're going to see where the Beatles got their MBE medals.
Wow.
And a funny story, because one of them, someone was asked what MBE stood for. They said it's Mr. Brian Epstein.
Wow.
Well, there's a connection there. There you
Indeed,
go.
that's a good one.
Anyway, let's go to Buckingham Palace. Where the Beatles got their MBEs. Of course, where Paul McCartney was knighted as well. Sir Paul. Well, of course, this is a well-known palace, Buckingham Palace, of
Yeah,
course.
well known.
And a lot of Beatles stories here. Firstly, of course, it's supposed to be in Help, the Beatles film.
Indeed.
It's supposed to take refuge here from the dreaded Kylie.
Kylie.
Ratsy, a bit of a secret, folks. Well, not really a secret. It wasn't filmed here. It was filmed at Clifton House, wasn't it?
Yes,
so
he
not
made
inside
that.
here.
The scene of the famous
Yes.
Profumo scandal.
Absolutely, in 63.
63.
Well, it broke in 63
Broke in
anyway.
63, yeah.
Anyway, back to the Beatles. And of course, the Beatles got their MBE medals here from the Queen in 1965. Like, MBE is one of the top awards the Queen can get on one of her subjects. But before the Beatles got it, it's normally given to war heroes. And these war heroes weren't very pleased. And these 4 pop stars got the same medals as them. And some of them sent their medals back to the Queen in protest.
Right.
But I think I agree with John Lennon when he's quoted at the time as saying, I think entertaining millions of people is better than killing millions of people. It's at a very fair point.
Especially now, in
Yeah,
this modern day.
absolutely. When the Beatles went to Buckingham Palace to get their medals, of course their fans came along as well. And they absolutely besieged the place.
Yeah.
Some of them tried to climb over the gates to get into the palace, but the police were on hand to keep them back the right side. Well, allegedly, according to John Lennon at least, the Beatles were very nervous at meeting the Queen. So nervous, in fact, they had a marijuana joint each in the Buckingham Palace toilets
Wow.
before meeting the Queen. Don't know that's completely true, John. He said this about 5 years after the event,
Early
didn't he,
1970
Keith?
to a
French journalist.
Yeah.
And at the time, he was trying to ruin the Beatles' nice guy image. What better way of doing that than saying you were high when meeting the Queen? And also, John added that he brought along a 5th joint in case Prince Charles wanted one as well. I think John's having a bit of a joke because it got reported as facts around the world, and you still see it in Beatles books as facts, but I don't think it's true. Cigarette, and you can possibly say
Yeah.
yes, but a joint, don't think so, John. Okay, we're going to leave Buckingham Palace at this point, and we're going back to Hammersmith to meet Mike and a rather special guest from a well-known band of the 60s.
Shapes of things.
Shapes of things. But we're going to have to say goodbye to you, Keith, at this point,
Richard,
aren't we?
it's been a pleasure.
It's been great. It's been a
And
real
I hope
pleasure.
you have a good rest
Yeah.
trip, and
And
I'll see you soon.
see you soon. See ya.
Take care.
We're now outside the Hammersmith Apollo, formerly the Hammersmith Odeon, a well-known music venue. Going to meet up with Mike again. Hi, Mike.
Hi Richard, how are you?
All right, thanks.
Well, as Richard said, we're outside of the Hammersmith Apollo, probably one of the greatest rock venues in the whole of the United Kingdom.
Yep.
Some of the concerts here included David Bowie as Ziggy Stardust.
Yeah, last time he appeared as Ziggy, that's right.
Pink Floyd, Queen,
Yeah.
and Concert for Campuchia.
Yeah.
More recently, we've had Bruce Springsteen and Kylie Minogue,
Yeah.
of course.
Slightly different music, and not on the stage together.
Indeed,
I
so
should add.
quite a spread. In fact, from the end of 1964, the Beatles appeared here on no less than 38 times,
They
I'm
did.
told. Sharing the stage with them was another group who came to replace the Rolling Stones in their South London territory. When we left Marylebone Station, I said we were off to meet a special guest star. That star is co-founder and rhythm guitarist of the Yardbirds,
Oh, cool.
Mr. Chris Jayer. So why don't we go in and meet him now?
Okay. Well, here we are on stage at the Hammersmith Odeon, which is quite a thrill for me anyway, and where the Beatles
and for me, I have to say,
and for Chris, and for me being a member of the Yardbirds as well on this very stage. So you must have some great memories of your time here.
Well, I mean, firstly, what's so impressive coming here is that it's hardly changed.
No, it's I've been here many times.
This is,
Yeah.
you know, normally when you come back to places, things look smaller. This
Yeah.
is a big stage, even by
Yes.
today's standards, and the original stage. Of course, in those days, when we played the Beatles Christmas show, it was all a seated audience.
Right.
The Beatles would, although they intermittently appeared, you
Yeah.
know, throughout the show
Yeah.
as Yetis,
Right.
they would. The finale, obviously, was the music
Beatles,
part.
Yeah, of course.
And of course, in those days, there was no fantastic PAs. All the
No.
sound came off the stage, little
Yeah.
Vox amps that we all had,
Right.
fabulous amps. But
Yeah.
in all honesty, you could never hear the Beatles.
No.
The
No.
screaming was astronomical.
Yeah. I
You
heard, I heard one story in a show in America. They decided to change songs in the middle of the tour, and Ringo forgot they changed the set, and he couldn't hear the announcement that Paul made what the next song was going to be. So Ringo played one song where all the rest were playing something else.
And it made no difference
And
whatsoever.
of course, they couldn't be heard by the audience because of all
No.
the screaming.
No,
So
no.
in the end, they got really fed up with it. In the end, just gave up.
Well, Lennon being Lennon, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, was at the height, well, you know, at the height, which continued, of course, with his sort of great humour, which we shared as well. And of course, you know, he would stop playing and mime and do funny antics, but it made no difference. The audience were here just to see the Beatles. I mean, they were a phenomenon at that point.
Right.
I mean, you have to understand, in those days, I think for about a year, when they when they emerged into the scene, and every newspaper pretty much was full of the Beatles. It was a front page story almost
course.
every day.
Yeah.
Okay.
How did you perceive the Beatles as characters?
Well, I remember sitting in the stalls on the, you know, we were here waiting for their arrival.
Right.
And of course, that was an exciting moment. I mean, we loved their music. They
Yeah.
made such an impact already by then, you know. And of course, that charisma
Right.
went before them. And they arrived from the back, walking down. Of course, Brian Epstein was with them, wearing
Yes.
his sort of slightly Russian hat.
Right.
But the sort of what I perceived of them during the time we spent with them, you know, pretty much was, well, Paul McCartney he already had developed that kind of easygoing PR style
Right.
about him. John Lennon was definitely caustic and sarcastic, and for me and everybody in the band, especially Eric, much more sort of an interesting character.
Yes.
Ringo, bless him, was the sort of classic drummer, slight buffoon, again with a dry
Right.
sense of humour. George Harrison was the quiet one.
Right.
He was the
He was
quiet
the quiet one.
Yeah, very much so.
Yes.
So, you know, you had in Paul this easygoing, hiya lads, you know, talk to anybody.
Right.
I felt John was the captain, though,
Right.
as a band, you know.
Sure.
Even, of course, even though you had this terrific partnership between
Yeah.
Lennon and McCartney. And, you know, Ringo and George were the sort of slightly more backroom part of the engine.
Right. Of course, the Yardbirds are very much a London group, and the Beatles from Liverpool. Did you notice was there any sort of rivalry or anything like that, or?
Hard to believe, but in those days, the North was a different country and the
Yeah.
South was a different country.
Right.
The only link was the recently opened M1.
Right.
And that was a novelty, of course. And down here in the south, you know, it was the Rolling Stones, the Yardbirds, those sort of bands. Up there, it was the Mersey sound. And, of course, the accent and everything else was completely different.
Yes.
Interestingly enough, the Yardbirds did play, we went to the Cavern, a
Right.
very memorable show, because it took us, we must have been the only band to have spent 24 hours on the motorway. You know, we got lost in fog.
Oh dear.
But of course, I'd never been to Liverpool. It was literally like going to
Yes.
another foreign country.
Right.
And I distinctly remember that all the Liverpudlians, especially the girls, all wore dark leather jackets, had dark hair, and spoke with that lovely Scouse accent, which was a little unintelligible.
Yes.
But of course, you know, these guys are actually, they're starting to be quite wealthy. He said, "Oh, come down to the car park," with him and Paul McCartney, still both dressed in their Yeti costumes, very reverent, you know. So let's go down there and have a look.
Sure,
you know.
let's have a look at the stage door.
After your
Definitely. Yes. This is the stage door.
Yeah, this is the stage door. And the memory I have of this
Sign's door.
is, I think actually it might have even been during the performance. There was a gap, and I don't think they actually even left the stage door, and they had Rolls-Royce drive all their models around in a circle, around here, out the back, and then round again, just so the Beatles could have a look and make a choice. And they just, you know, were just choosing them, you know. And I think it was at this point that John Lennon chose that big white Rolls-Royce, which he irreverently painted psychedelic.
one. Yep.
But of course, I mean, Rolls-Royce in those days was very establishment. All the drivers were chauffeured up and very stiff. And of course, the Beatles were just treating it as a huge joke. Typical sort of typical style.
John was a great practical joker, because I heard a story that he used to make tape recordings of a car crash and play them full volume out of the window of the car, so the people behind would think they were involved in the car crash. That's one of his little jokes he used to
Sounds
do.
like a sort of John Bonham one. Yes,
Yeah.
good for him.
Good for him. Well, Chris, thanks for coming along and sharing your memories of the Hammersmith Odeon and this wonderful time.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Great memories for me.
Great. And we're not quite finished here yet, because just around the corner here is where the Beatles did a scene for A Hard Day's Night on the famous fire escape. So let's go and have a look at it. Oh, Mike. Fancy seeing you here. Well, these steps here are rather famous. You might recognise them from a Beatles film, A Hard Day's Night. Probably the most important scene in the film. Before this, they've been stuck in a train, stuck in hotel rooms, stuck in the theatre. They're very claustrophobic. But finally, they get a chance to get out. And in fact, they shout, "We're out!" And they run down the fire escape here with the song Can't Buy Me Love playing. Well, actually, that scene was shot in 4 different locations. The inside was at the Scala Theatre, the actual theatre they used. Then, of course, they used the fire escape here at Hammersmith. And then they're seen running down a field. Well, there's no field here at Hammersmith, obviously. The one shot was done from a helicopter near Gatwick Airport, and the other shot on ground level in Isleworth nearby. So 4 different locations for that just one scene in the film. Probably the most famous scene in the film they did. Okay, well, the Beatles running off into the distance around the field. I think we're quite near the end of the tour, aren't we, Mike?
Yeah, they must have run down these steps and really be delighted to get in the fresh air.
Yeah, so let's go and have a bit of fun ourselves.
Okay.
Well, that's just about it for our DVD of the Beatles London. As the Beatles once said, hope you have enjoyed the show.
What wonderful memories, though, Richard, of the Beatles about to
Absolutely.
conquer the world. On that high note, I think it's a very good point to bring our tour, as you say, to an end. From their early rejection by the Decca label to the inevitable breakup of the group, leaving them individually to try and conquer the world all over again. London is probably one of the most famous entertainment centres of the world, with the early performances of the Shakespearean plays at the nearby Globe Theatre. Never before, and probably never again, will we witness such an illustrious group of performers as in the 60s, with the Beatles taking pride of place.
Well, that's right, Mike. They conquered their hometown of Liverpool, went to Hamburg, conquered there, and then, of course, came to London and did the same here. Well, we've been all over London on the tour. We've been in the east to see Tom Murray. We've been into central London. We've been to Abbey Road. Of course, walked across the famous crossing, seen the studios. We've seen film sites for Hard Day's Night and Help. Of course, we met many people on the way. And as the Beatles once said, you're such a lovely audience. We'd like to take you home with us. Goodbye.